while we wait, really, still no decision about forming a government. It could be tomorrow. It could be next Monday. It could, well, hopefully it's going to be before Christmas. Joining me on the program now, Dr Bryce Edwards from Victoria University. Bryce, kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time.
Morena, Andrew.
To be fair, this isn't the longest wait for a government. We've had some pretty long waits beforehand, and honestly, we're definitely not the gold medalists internationally when it comes to this. I mean, it's one of those situations to say, oh gosh, it's not so bad. Some people are even worse than this. Is Belgium pretty much top of the list, Bryce, in terms of how long they had to wait to form a government?
Yes, we can compare ourselves to a lot of other European countries in particular that have a similar electoral system. Mm-hmm. And yes, Belgium does. And so, yes, they hold the record as far as I know. They failed to form a government in 2010 and 2011. It took 541 days.
Wow.
In Belgium to form that government. And there's lots of other European democracies that take a while. Spain, at the moment, they had an election in July of this year, mm-hmm. and they're still piecing together their coalition there. Germany, Denmark, they're quite well known to take many months to pull coalitions together. So in Netherlands, 2 years ago, I think it was,
yep.
It took 10 months to pull together a coalition. But I would point out that these really long coalition negotiations tend to involve dozens of parties.
Yeah.
So in Belgium and Netherlands, they have a much bigger party system. So their parliament typically, will have sort of 12 or 17 parties mm-hmm. in it. And it has a lot more moving parts. So I guess the problem with the negotiations that Christopher Luxon, the incoming Prime Minister, is doing, it's only involving two other parties. And they're not, those parties, New Zealand First and ACT, are not considering any other options. They're not considering going with Labour or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And so I think people's expectations that this set of negotiations would be pretty straightforward, just haven't been met. And of course, I think Luxon himself really erred in kind of sort of upping himself and talking about his experience in the business world with mergers and acquisitions. And he was even a bit critical of John Key and Helen Clark for how long they took to bring together negotiations. And he thought he would be quicker. Yeah. So, I mean, he hasn't quite, met his own what he was expecting, I think.
Having said that, though, I suppose there is a lot more in common in comparison to some of the European examples that you gave beforehand, and that's probably why we've got this threshold, so that the minnow parties aren't a part of the mix when it comes to forming a government. There is lots in common, though, when it comes to law and order, in terms of tax relief and those sorts of things. There's a lot of overlap between party policies, but also, to be fair, this is the first time that anybody's tried to form a government where there is more than one full coalition partner. So it is more complex than what we've seen before in New Zealand, Bryce.
It is actually. So typically under MMP, we've had a major party in government, and sometimes they've allowed one other minor party to be in cabinet mm-hmm. with them in a full coalition. Other times they have kept those minor parties out of cabinet, given them ministerial positions outside of cabinet, or just very basic confidence and supply agreements. This time, the idea is to bring them both into the tent.
Yep.
So this isn't what John Key did, for example. He had, when he was running his government, he had the Maori Party and ACT outside of the tent, yep. just as ministers outside of cabinet. This time around, all three of them want to be in cabinet and have a full coalition. So, yep, that's right. It is a bit more complex. And even though, I think you'd say ACT is fairly close to national ideologically, mm-hmm. there's still some big differences there.
Yep.
And David Seymour has really been pushing quite strongly for this this referendum on treaty principles. And New Zealand First, they are kind of, Winston Peters is a wily operator, and he does have some big differences with National, and I think he would have been very difficult to deal with, having, he's got some demands that he wants his parties, to be able to own.
And now we're talking a coalition, not a merger here. So there will be points of difference, and these parties will want to maintain those points of difference if they want to get a good result next election. But what do you see some of these sticking points might be, apart from the obvious one as who gets to be Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, supposedly they've dealt with all the policy issues first. Okay. So they've got an agreement about what will be the program of this government, and we don't know what those things are. Like I said, the issue of the treaty principles has been a big sticking point, and ACT have wanted a referendum on that. I suspect they won't get a referendum. I suspect they will get some other compromise where we have some Royal Commission or working group to try and deal with those principles of the treaty, because there's a lot of disquiet about what the principles actually are and how they're being interpreted by the courts and by evolving governments. The other big one is tax. So, National have, promised tax cuts, but both ACT and New Zealand First are suspicious, I think with good reason, that we can't afford tax cuts at the moment, and that National's numbers don't really add up very well, and we're going to have to borrow money for those tax cuts. So that's been a big negotiation. But yes, then they move on to the ministerial portfolios, the allocation of roles, and that could still be quite a big sticking point. The Deputy Prime Minister, who do they give that to? Do they give it to David Seymour? Do they give it to Winston Peters? Or do you have a kind of compromise by maybe giving it to Nicola Willis as the Finance Minister?
I mean, just jumping into that one, I suppose Winston's got the experience, Seymour's got the numbers, but in terms of overall percentages, and National's got it in spades, really. So, be interesting to see which way they go. Any picks on what's the likely outcome?
I mean, there's rumours of creative things being looked at. So there's the Fiji option, whereby you have multiple deputy prime ministers. I think in Fiji they have 3 deputy prime ministers, and so you could have both Seymour and Peters.
I'm not sure Fiji is a great example of a stable, secure government. No. Also in that regard,
another option.
Even if you have multiples, though, there would have to be a senior. There would have to be first cab off the rank if the prime minister was out of town. And it is this jockeying, this positioning, this who's first, who's second. Deputy Prime Minister. This is where it all gets a little bit sort of point scoring and positional, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think it will be quite symbolically important for the mana, for the respect of those parties. And I mean, another option is to give them 1.5 years each as deputy. So split the term down in the middle. But the safest option is just to give it to Nicola Willis. And then there's no one really with their noses out of joint. But
Nicola Willis also secured finance. That's not negotiable, I understand.
That's exactly right. But there's other portfolios that New Zealand First and ACT really do want. ACT want the education portfolio, which would, be a pretty major one. New Zealand First, apparently are wanting Winston Peters to be Attorney General. Okay. And so, that's normally not a sought-after position, but the argument is that for New Zealand First to have that, they would have the ability to determine who become the judges in New Zealand and have an influence on that. And also, Winston Peters has had a long-running sort of feud. It's kind of like
he's wanting to fill out his bingo card. He's ticked a lot of the other boxes, but he's never done this one before, right? And
indeed, this would be a new one, and it would give him a lot of actual backroom power. So I still think, we're hearing talks that maybe they could sign an agreement on Thursday. So what's that, tomorrow?
Tomorrow, yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's still another week away. Those positions will be fiercely fought over. and it's not as simple as dealing with David Seymour and Winston Peters as people might assume.
Now, the other question that comes to mind is, what do the newly elected MPs do while they wait? I mean, some have come back, but there's a whole bunch of particularly national MPs where this is their first time. Are they just sitting around Wellington or flying back and forth? Or, I mean, they're on full pay, I assume, even though they're not doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the new ones, the newbies, will be in Wellington learning the ropes, you know, and being quiet as they normally are.
Yeah.
But the experienced ones, especially who have just fought a very long election campaign, I think will be taking a breather, spending time with their family and friends and so forth. And in the case of the Labour Party, licking their wounds and working out, you know, how do we rebuild from this?
Mm-hmm.
But there is, of course, also the Port Waikato by-election on at the moment, and so two of the elected MPs are actually the front runners in this. I forget now suddenly who the national list MP who is running, but you've got New Zealand First's Casey Costello, who supposedly is doing very well in this by-election and has an outside chance.
Yeah, well, hey, be interesting to see what happens there. And to be fair, look, they might not get much of a Christmas break, so rest while you can, actually. Running to catch up once a government is formed, I suspect. Bryce, appreciate your insight as always. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew.